Hey y'all, it's Tina with Viva Beat Music. So in this video, it's all about MIDI. MIDI is a great way to expand your creativity when making music, and the options are limitless when programming it because it can be manipulated in so many different ways, and it can also evolve to sound like anything you want it to. So today's video is all about that. We're going to explore MIDI and how it can be programmed into your DAW. So let's get started. Now, the single best tool in programming MIDI is a MIDI controller, which is relatively cheap to purchase. And in the description below is a link to my free home studio gear guide if you want information on some budget controllers you can purchase along with other great studio gear on a budget. However, if you don't own a MIDI controller, that's completely okay. You can still use your computer keyboard and mouse to program MIDI in your DAW. It will just be a little bit more time consuming and not as easy to play out. A MIDI controller is built like a piano keyboard, but does not contain any sounds built in. It is simply a controller that allows you to send MIDI data to your DAW by playing on piano-style keys. A simple USB MIDI controller will work wonders by increasing productivity, creativity, and workflow. So the first thing to do after you plug in your MIDI controller to your computer USB port is to create an instrument track. And in Logic Pro or GarageBand, it'll usually default to open up the library that contains a bunch of different virtual instruments that you can use. Also, if you've purchased virtual instrument plugins, you can open them up on this instrument track as well by just replacing this virtual instrument that comes defaulted already and then just choosing it in your instrument panel. I'm going to select a stock virtual drum kit and I'm just going to record a simple drum beat to get some MIDI data going through. Most of the time, these MIDI controllers are just plug and play, so you literally can just plug in the USB cord to your computer and it'll start reading the data. So if I start striking the keys, they'll start to play different things on the drum set that I have preloaded here. And if you'll notice on my MIDI controller, it has drum pads on the top here, which makes it a little bit more fun to play drum sounds out, but it's also to program different sounds as well. In this case, I'm just gonna go ahead and play like a simple beat out of the drum pads here, just so that you can see how the MIDI controller works. Okay, so just a little simple drum beat, nothing too crazy. As you can see, there's MIDI data that started coming through already. And now that we have the MIDI recorded, I'm just going to open up the MIDI editor. And if you're using Logic Pro or GarageBand, you can double click on the region to open that up. Or you can click on the scissors icon on the top left to open the MIDI editor up as well. Okay, so now that I have the MIDI editor window open, this is where we can begin to manipulate the MIDI notes. We can change the pitch, the velocity, which is essentially how soft or loud the note will be, the timing of the notes, and all sorts of other information about it. And so there's different ways that I can go about changing this information. As you can see, these notes are not exactly in time, and the different colors mean that they're all different velocities. So the lighter the color, the softer the velocity is going to be. And the more red it is, the louder the velocity is. To change a pitch of a note, I can drag the notes up or down within the MIDI editor. So the pitch in this case just indicates which part of the drum kit I'm putting the note on. So right now, as you can see, this note is on the kick. And if I move it, it goes to different parts of the drum set. And right here on the side, it will tell you where on the keyboard you can find different parts of the instrument you have preloaded. In any kind of DAW that you use, the MIDI editor essentially works the same way and will let you adjust these parameters as you need to. So since I'm using Logic Pro, I'm going to be referencing a lot of information from Logic, but it also is very reminiscent of GarageBand. And you can use these same techniques within GarageBand as well because the MIDI editor is very similar to this one. And if you're using Pro Tools or Cubase or any other kind of DAW not related to this particular Apple software, you can still manipulate those notes. It just might be a little bit different in the way that you see it on the display. Let's say I wanted to use this particular track as part of my song, so I'm not using an actual drummer, I'm just using what I recorded through the MIDI track. The first thing that I'd probably want to do is make sure that the velocity is not all over the place. And right now it is, because I kind of just played it, randomly. I wasn't really too focused on sounding perfect or anything like that, which is completely okay, because the cool thing about using the MIDI editor is that you can change all this stuff after the fact. And usually what I recommend when you're playing MIDI is just to focus on the music itself. Don't worry about sounding perfect, just play your heart out. So one of the things I can do is I can change the velocity so there's not sections that are overly loud and sections that are too soft. And it's not too all over the place. There's some sections that are a little bit too loud, but what I can do is I can either change the individual notes velocity, or I can change it as a region. And that can be done in this drop-down menu right here by selecting velocity, or I can use the command because I love commands. So the key command to get to that is T and then V to get the velocity tool. So once I have the velocity tool, I can grab the note and either bring it up to increase that velocity, or I can bring it down to have a very soft velocity. So that's how you grab it individually. You can also select everything as a whole. So Command A to do that. And then I can do the same thing and do them all together. And so those are a couple quick ways to change the velocity of the notes that you have recorded already. And I like using these tools to a point, but in this case, let's say this was like the intro of the song, for example, and I'm trying to change the region so that it's easier to manipulate as a whole and not individually, because that could take some time if you're going through each note, making sure that the velocity is what you want it to be. So what I can do is I can highlight the whole thing, and I can go over to my functions. Under MIDI transform, there's something called random velocity. This is also a trick that I like to use to make the drum sound more human, because when you have a human drummer, they're not hitting the parts of the drum set at equal volume. They're very random and at times erratic. And so I like to stick between a medium high and a high velocity, because I don't want to be too soft where you can't really hear the tone of that part of the drum set, but I also don't want to be too high where it's just overly loud. So what I'll do is I'll usually stick to maybe 110 and 90, for example. I'll hit select and operate. And as you can see, all these notes are at random velocities now, but they're within a range that is a little bit more reasonable and more human. So those are the ways that you can change the velocity. Now, another way that you can manipulate the MIDI is through quantization. So let's say you have a 120 BPM, like the way I have it in this session, as the tempo, and then you recorded some MIDI using the click track, but maybe you got off tempo somewhere, and as you can see, I got off tempo a little bit in the beginning here. Quantizing lets you move those notes to match the tempo of the song so that everything is in time. So quantizing helps you save some time by not having to re-record a part just to fit the tempo of the song. And that's what's so great about MIDI. So I can move, just like with anything else that you want to change about the MIDI, you can move the notes individually, or I can change the region as a whole. So in Logic, I can quantize within the MIDI editor itself, or I can quantize on the left region menu. And it gives me those same options as well, just in case we don't have this open. And so I want to make this more in time, but I don't want to make it too perfect where it takes that human element out of the picture. So I'm going to do the whole region. And so these options that it gives you, like 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, this is all dependent on what was played. If I was playing a lot of 16th notes, then I would probably select this option. But if I was playing just single notes, then I'd probably select 1/4. So to make it easier, you can select 1/16, 132, I don't really use too much, or 1/64. It's kind of rare, but if you like, you can stick to 1/16 just to make it easier for yourself and not have to think about the technical stuff like that if you're not super into music theory or stuff like that. So you can select 1/16, and if you'll notice, all the notes moved in time. So they're all lined up to be perfectly in tempo. Everything's in time, nothing's out of place. But again, maybe you're using this for your track and you want it to sound human. You want it to sound like you had an actual drummer playing this for your song. So if that's the case, you might not want to quantize to be perfectly in time. So if you'll notice here on the left side, you'll have something called strength. The strength will determine how much in time it will move those notes. So right now it's at 100%, so they're perfectly in time. But if I move it more to the left, you'll see that the notes are starting to move out of time. This is what you can use to preserve that human element to it. So I don't want it to be too perfect in this case, so I'm gonna leave it around 72 so that it's not super in time. So these are the basics of programming MIDI within your DAW. Just to recap, the best tool for programming MIDI is a MIDI controller. You can use the MIDI controller to play any virtual instrument within your DAW, and you can manipulate all sorts of MIDI information by changing the velocity, which is how loud or soft the notes are, the length, and the timing of the notes, just to name a few. And a tip here just before I end this video is to remember that when recording MIDI, focus on the performance of the instrument you're playing rather than the technicalities like staying in tempo or having perfect pitch, because that information can all be adjusted later. And as always, feel free to let me know of any videos that you'd like to see in the future, and I will make sure to make videos geared towards those particular topics. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.